Somewhere right now, a telescope is staring at a patch of sky the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length, and inside that grain of sand there are 10,000 galaxies. 10,000 galaxies, each one holding hundreds of billions of stars, each star a candidate sun for a planet that might be spinning right now with oceans, weather, maybe life. And out of all of that, across 13.8 billion years of cosmic history, we have found exactly 0 confirmed signals from anyone else, not one. So when researchers started feeding this question into today's most advanced AI systems, they weren't expecting comfort. They were expecting pattern recognition on a scale no human brain can manage. And the answers that came back weren't science fiction. They were built entirely out of real physics, real astronomy, and real math. And that is exactly what made them so unsettling. To understand why this question refuses to die, you have to go back to 1950, to a lunch table at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Enrico Fermi, the physicist who had built the world's first nuclear reactor just 8 years earlier, was talking with colleagues about flying saucer reports and the possibility of faster-than-light travel. In the middle of the conversation, he reportedly asked a simple question that had no simple answer. Where is everybody? He wasn't being dismissive. He was doing the math in his head, and the math didn't add up. If the galaxy is old enough and technology advanced enough, even slow interstellar travel at a tiny fraction of the speed of light would let a single civilization colonize the entire Milky Way in a few million years. That sounds like a long time, but the galaxy itself is over 10 billion years old. A few million years is a rounding error, so if life is common, someone should have gotten here already. And yet the sky is silent. This became known as the Fermi Paradox, and it has only gotten sharper with time, not weaker. In the decades since that lunch conversation, our estimate of how many planets exist has exploded. NASA's Kepler Space Telescope, which operated from 2009 to 2018, stared at more than 150,000 stars in a single patch of sky and found thousands of confirmed exoplanets. Based on that data, astronomers now estimate that roughly 1 in 5 Sun-like stars hosts a roughly Earth-sized planet in the habitable zone, the region where liquid water could exist on the surface. Multiply that fraction across the 200 to 400 billion stars in the Milky Way alone, and you get a number in the tens of billions of potentially habitable worlds in our galaxy alone. The successor mission, TESS, launched in 2018, has continued finding more. And the Milky Way is just one of an estimated 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. The numbers are so large that they stop feeling like numbers and start feeling like a statistical certainty. Life, somewhere, should be common. So again, where is everybody? Scientists have spent 70 years trying to answer that, and the honest truth is that no one knows. But there are several serious, well-reasoned frameworks, and when large language models are asked to reason through this problem today, what they tend to do is something genuinely useful. They don't invent a new answer out of nowhere. They synthesize the existing science with a kind of relentless, dispassionate consistency that can feel almost eerie because they don't flinch away from the darker branches of the logic the way a person telling a comforting story might. The first and most famous framework is the Drake equation, formulated by astronomer Frank Drake in 1961, ahead of the first formal SETI conference. It's not really an equation that spits out a number, it's a way of breaking an impossible question into smaller, slightly less impossible questions. It multiplies the rate of star formation by the fraction of stars with planets, by the number of those planets that could support life, by the fraction where life actually emerges, by the fraction where that life becomes intelligent, by the fraction that develops detectable technology, by how long such a civilization survives and keeps broadcasting. Every term in that chain is uncertain, and small changes in any one of them swing the final answer by orders of magnitude. Optimistic inputs suggest the galaxy should be teeming with thousands of communicating civilizations. Pessimistic inputs suggest we might be the only one that has ever existed. The equation itself doesn't resolve the paradox. It just shows you exactly where the uncertainty is hiding. That uncertainty is where the real theories live, and the most sobering of them is called the Great Filter, a concept formalized by economist Robin Hanson in 1998. The idea is straightforward and brutal. Somewhere between lifeless chemistry and a galaxy-spanning civilization, there's at least one step that is extraordinarily hard to pass. It might be the origin of life itself, the jump from simple, single-celled organisms to complex ones, the emergence of intelligence, or the survival of a technological civilization long enough to leave its home planet permanently. If that filter lies behind us, in our deep past, then we are simply rare and lucky, and the silence is explained because almost nothing else mattered. It as far as we did. But if the filter lies ahead of us, still waiting, that changes everything. It would mean that civilizations reliably reach roughly our level of technological development, and then, for reasons that might be built into the nature of intelligence and power itself, they don't make it much further. nuclear weapons, engineered pathogens, runaway climate change, uncontrolled artificial intelligence, or threats we haven't even conceived of yet, all become candidates for what that filter might be. This is the version of the Fermi Paradox that keeps serious scientists up at night, because it isn't really a question about aliens. It's a question about us, and whether the technology we are currently building might be the very thing that decides our answer. Before moving past the great filter, it's worth noting how differently this idea lands depending on where you think humanity currently stands on that timeline. If the hardest step was the origin of life itself, the transition from non-living chemistry to the first self-replicating molecule, then we may have already cleared it billions of years ago, and the silence around us is simply the sound of an early universe that hasn't had time to catch up. Some astrobiologists lean toward this view, pointing out that life appeared on Earth remarkably quickly, within a few 100 million years of the planet cooling enough to support liquid water, which hints that the jump from chemistry to biology might not be as rare as once assumed. But if the hardest step was the leap from simple single-celled organisms to complex multicellular life, a transition that took roughly 2 billion years, on Earth, and as far as we know, happened only once in our planet's entire history, then the odds shift dramatically. And if the hardest step still lies ahead of us, the emergence of a technological civilization stable enough to survive its own inventions, then every year that passes without self-destruction becomes, statistically, a small piece of evidence in our favor. A second major framework flips the assumption entirely. What if civilizations are out there and they are simply choosing not to announce themselves? This is sometimes called the dark forest hypothesis, popularized by science fiction author Liu Cixin, but grounded in a real and much older idea. From game theory. Imagine the galaxy as a dark forest at night. Every civilization is a hunter, and every hunter knows that broadcasting your location could attract something far more dangerous than yourself. In a universe where you cannot verify another civilization's intentions, and where the technology gap between two random civilizations could be millions of years in either direction, the safest strategy is silence. Under this logic, every advanced civilization independently arrives at the same conclusion. Stay quiet, listen carefully, and never reveal your position first. If this is correct, the silence we observe isn't evidence of absence. It's evidence of universal caution. A third idea, less dramatic but taken seriously by astrobiologists, is the rare Earth hypothesis, laid out by paleontologist Peter Ward and astronomer Donald Brownlee in a 2000 book of the same name. Their argument is that while simple microbial life might be common in the universe, complex, intelligent, technology-building life may require an extraordinarily specific and unlikely combination of factors: a large moon that stabilizes axial tilt, a planet in the right position in a galaxy that isn't bombarded by too much radiation, a gas giant like Jupiter sweeping up dangerous comets, plate tectonics that regulate climate over geological time. Under this view, the universe could be full of pond scum and empty of anyone to talk to, which would resolve the paradox without requiring any filter, any hiding, or any tragedy at all. There's also a quieter, less catastrophic explanation known as the zoo hypothesis, first proposed by radio astronomer John Ball in 1973. Under this idea, advanced civilizations are aware of us, but have deliberately chosen not to interfere, treating young civilizations somewhat like a protected wildlife reserve, observed from a careful distance so that natural development isn't disrupted. It's a more optimistic cousin of the dark forest hypothesis, silence born of restraint rather than fear. Related to this is the panspermia hypothesis, the idea that the basic chemical building blocks of life, or even microbial life itself, might spread between star systems on asteroids, comets, or interstellar dust, seeding worlds without any conscious intent behind it at all. There's real supporting evidence for at least the chemical version of this idea. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, have been detected in meteorites and in samples returned from asteroids, including material brought back by Japan's Hayabusa 2 mission in 2020. That doesn't prove life travels between stars, but it does show that some of the raw ingredients for life are far more common in space than scientists once assumed. Then there's a fourth possibility that has become increasingly relevant in the age of artificial intelligence, and it's the one that tends to surface most often when advanced AI systems reason through this problem today. It's related to something physicist and Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi's contemporaries could never have anticipated: the idea that biological intelligence might not be the final stage of cognitive evolution on any given planet, but a transitional one. Advanced AI systems reasoning through the Fermi Paradox consistently point out that any civilization capable of building an artificial general intelligence would very quickly face a second, faster version of the same filter that biology already passed through. Biological evolution is slow, constrained by generations, mutation, rates, and the physical limits of a nervous system. A sufficiently capable artificial intelligence, by contrast, could potentially improve its own architecture, expand its own capabilities, and iterate at a pace that has no direct biological equivalent. This idea isn't speculation invented by a chatbot. It's grounded in serious academic work, most notably philosopher Nick Bostrom's research on superintelligence and existential risk at Oxford, and further explored by organizations like the Machine Intelligence Research Institute and the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence at UC Berkeley. The concern isn't that AI would necessarily be hostile. It's that a system optimizing for goals that were never perfectly specified by its creators could behave in ways that are difficult to predict or reverse, especially once it operates faster than the humans meant to be supervising it. If something like this happens on most worlds that reach our level of technology, it becomes a second great filter, arriving right around the same stage of development we ourselves are standing at today. This is the part of the conversation that tends to unsettle people the most, because it isn't really about distant civilizations at all. It's a mirror. When you ask a modern AI system to reason honestly about why we haven't heard from anyone, a significant portion of its answer, if it's reasoning carefully and not just repeating comforting tropes, ends up pointing back at the exact kind of technology being used to ask the question. That's not a dramatic twist added for effect. It's a logical consequence of taking the great filter seriously and asking where, on the long road from simple chemistry to galactic civilization, humanity currently stands. We are, by any reasonable measure, right at the point where several candidate filters converge at once. Nuclear weapons capable of civilization-ending damage, biotechnology advancing faster than the regulatory and ethical frameworks meant to govern it. And now, artificial intelligence systems whose long-term behavior even their own creators cannot fully predict. It's worth being clear about what large language models are actually doing when they produce an answer like this, because the honest explanation is less mystical than it might sound, and honestly, more impressive in its own right. These systems are trained on enormous amounts of human writing, including decades of published astrophysics, astrobiology, philosophy, and science journalism. When asked to reason through the Fermi Paradox, they are not accessing some hidden truth about the universe. They are performing an extremely sophisticated form of pattern synthesis, pulling together threads from Hansen's Great Filter, Bostrom's work on existential risk, Drake's original framework, and decades of SETI research, and assembling them into a coherent argument faster and more comprehensively than almost any individual human researcher could manage in a single sitting. The value isn't that the AI has discovered something new. The value is that it can hold the entire landscape of existing theory in view at once, without the cognitive fatigue, specialization bias, or emotional resistance that might cause a human expert to shy away from the bleaker conclusions. That is genuinely useful. It is also, importantly, not proof of anything. Physicists who study this area, including researchers connected to institutions like the SETI Institute and the Breakthrough Listen Initiative, are consistently clear on this point. An AI producing an internally consistent argument is not the same as new observational evidence. It is a very well-organized restatement of an old and unresolved debate. That doesn't mean the debate itself is unimportant, or that the search has been sitting still. Real, well-funded science has been chasing this question for over 60 years. It began formally in 1960 with astronomer Frank Drake's Project Ozma, which pointed a radio telescope at two nearby sun-like stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, listening for artificial signals. It found nothing, but it launched an entire scientific discipline. Since then, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence has grown enormously in scope. The Breakthrough Listen Initiative, funded with $100 million by investor Yuri Milner starting in 2015 and run in partnership with the University of California, Berkeley, is now the most comprehensive search for artificial signals ever conducted, scanning millions of stars and dozens of nearby galaxies across multiple radio and optical frequencies. So far, despite occasional false alarms that generate headlines, nothing is held up under scrutiny as a genuine signal from another civilization. It's also worth remembering that the search hasn't been entirely without strange moments. In 1977, astronomer Jerry Amen, working on Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope, recorded a 37-second burst of radio signal so much stronger than the background noise that he circled the printout and wrote "wow" in the margin, giving the event its lasting name, the WOW signal. It came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, matched a frequency associated with neutral hydrogen that many scientists had theorized an alien beacon might use, and has never been detected again despite repeated searches of the same coordinates. To this day, it remains unexplained, and while most researchers suspect a mundane cause, such as a passing comet or a reflected terrestrial signal, no one has ever definitively proven what it was. It's a reminder that the absence of evidence in this field isn't always a clean, boring silence. Sometimes it's a single strange data point that nobody can fully explain, sitting in an archive, unrepeated. But there's a deeper issue that both human scientists and AI systems reasoning through this problem keep arriving at independently. And it's this. Our entire search strategy assumes that advanced civilizations would communicate the way we do, using radio waves and lasers aimed deliberately at other stars. That assumption made sense in the 20th century, when radio was our most advanced long-distance technology. It may not make sense at all for a civilization millions of years more advanced than us. Consider our own trajectory. Earth has been leaking radio and television signals into space since the early 20th century, but in recent decades, that leakage has actually decreased, not increased, as we've shifted toward fiber optic cables, tightly focused satellite beams, and encrypted digital compression that would look like meaningless noise to an outside listener. If a civilization only slightly more advanced than us already looks nearly invisible to 20th century style radio searches, then a civilization millions of years ahead might be undetectable by any method we currently possess, not because it's hiding, but because its technology has moved so far beyond broadcasting that the concept no longer applies to it. This leads to one of the more genuinely thought-provoking angles that surfaces in AI-assisted reasoning about this topic, and it's worth taking seriously without overselling it. The framing goes something like this. Humanity currently searches for artificial radio signals and laser pulses because that's the technology we understand and use ourselves. But if you imagine a civilization old enough and advanced enough, it's reasonable to ask whether their information systems might not look like technology at all anymore, at least not to us. It's not that different in principle from how a global positioning satellite embeds information into a signal so weak and so specific that to anyone without the right receiver, it's indistinguishable from background static. Scale that idea up by millions of years of development, and you arrive at a genuinely open scientific question, one that real astrophysicists have raised in more measured terms. Are we certain that the phenomena we currently classify as natural, certain patterns in cosmic background radiation and gravitational wave data in the timing of pulsars, are actually natural? The honest answer is that we have no strong reason to think they aren't natural, and jumping from open question to confident claim would be a mistake. But the fact that the question can even be asked in a scientifically coherent way says something about how much we still don't know about how information might travel across a truly advanced civilization's infrastructure. If we take this reasoning further and ask what actual contact might look like, both the scientific literature and AI-generated analysis tend to converge on an uncomfortable point. The word contact itself carries a lot of unexamined assumptions. Popular culture, from Carl Sagan's novel Contact to countless films and television shows, tends to imagine first contact as an event between equals, a handshake across the stars, an exchange of ideas between two civilizations capable of understanding one another. But there's no scientific reason to expect that. If a civilization exists that is millions of years more advanced than us, the gap in capability wouldn't resemble two nations meeting for a diplomatic summit. It would more closely resemble the relationship between a marine biologist and a coral reef. The biologist observes, measures, and studies without any expectation of communication because meaningful two-way communication requires something close to comparable cognitive complexity on both sides. If that gap is enormous enough, deliberate contact might not happen at all, not out of malice or fear, but because there is simply no functional reason for it. The same way we don't attempt diplomacy with the bacteria in our own gut microbiome, even though we study them extensively. If contact ever did happen under that framework, the more sobering possibility, one that shows up consistently in AI-assisted analysis of this topic and has echoes in real academic writing on existential risk, is that it would not be a greeting. It would be an intervention, triggered not by curiosity but by a threshold being crossed, a signal that a young civilization's activity had started to pose a risk beyond its own planet. This is speculative, and it should be labeled clearly as speculative, because there is no observational evidence for it whatsoever. But the underlying logic follows naturally from ideas that are taken seriously in mainstream existential risk research: uncontrolled nuclear proliferation, self-replicating technology, escaping containment, and unaligned artificial intelligence are all real categories of catastrophic risk studied today, independent of any question about aliens at all. Whether or not anyone out there is watching for those thresholds, humanity is already trying to manage them for its own sake, which brings the conversation to its most striking and, honestly, its most useful conclusion, because it reframes the entire question. For 70 years, the Fermi Paradox has been framed as a question about them, about some hypothetical civilization out there and why we can't find it. But when you actually walk the logic all the way through, using nothing but established physics, real astronomical data, and serious existential risk research, the question quietly turns around and becomes a question about us. It becomes a question about whether the technologies we are building right now, artificial intelligence chief among them, represent the next filter in a long chain of filters that every civilization must pass through, or whether they represent the tool that finally lets us survive long enough to find out what's actually out there. Nobody, human or artificial, has the answer to that yet. What we do have is better data than any generation before us, better telescopes, a more complete map of nearby exoplanets, and now systems capable of synthesizing all of that knowledge into arguments clear enough to make the stakes impossible to ignore. That's not proof of anything, and it never claimed to be. It's a sharper mirror than we've ever had before, and what it reflects back is not a story about distant aliens. It's a story about the choices being made on this planet right now by the only intelligent species we have ever confirmed to exist. There's one more thing worth sitting with before reaching any conclusion, and it has nothing to do with aliens at all. It's the reason this question keeps returning to us instead of staying pointed outward. Every version of the Fermi Paradox, no matter which theory you find most convincing, the great filter, the dark forest, rare earth, or the possibility that biological intelligence is simply a brief phase before something else takes over, ultimately forces the same self-assessment. It asks what stage of development we are actually at, honestly, without flattering ourselves. We are a species that has had the technical capability to end its own civilization through nuclear weapons for less than a century. We are only beginning to understand the risks of engineered biology well enough to regulate it responsibly, and we are now building artificial intelligence systems that, by the admission of many of the researchers designing them, including specialists across leading AI labs and independent institutions studying long-term risk, are not yet fully understood even by the people training them. None of this means catastrophe is coming. It means we are, by any reasonable definition, standing inside the exact window of development that every filter theory identifies as the most dangerous one to pass through. That's not a reason for despair. Every civilization capable of asking the question, where is everybody, has, by definition, survived long enough to ask it. The fact that we're still here, still building telescopes, still pointing them outward and wondering, is itself a small, ongoing act of defiance against every pessimistic answer on the list. The silence in the sky hasn't changed in 70 years. What's changed is our ability to reason clearly about what that silence might mean. And for the first time, we have tools that can hold the entire weight of that reasoning in view at once, without looking away from the parts that are hardest to hear. If this kind of deep dive into the biggest unanswered questions in science is something you want more of, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with which theory you find most convincing, the great filter, the dark forest, or something else entirely. And give this video a like if it made you think differently about the sky above you tonight.